Hello knitting friends, today I'm sharing this adorable baby and toddler cardigan. It's a top-down raglan with a clean classic shape, sweet garter stitch details at the collar and cuffs, and a decorative stitch pattern along the hem for a little extra texture. It's such a fun knit with beautiful finishing touches. Let's get started. All right, let's get started knitting this adorable child-size cardigan. We're going to be knitting this from the top down and knitting it flat, doing some raglan increases, and then finishing it off with this really beautiful accent stitch near the hemline. Now this is an intermediate pattern difficulty-wise. For the sake of keeping this video at appropriate length, I'm going to assume that you know how to do the basic knit and purl stitches, casting on, binding off, increase, decrease stitches. So I won't explain those in great detail, but everything else about the sweater we will go through step by step. The link to the written pattern is in the description below if you'd like to follow along with that, or note the instructions for the different sizes. I'm going to be making an 18-month size pattern for our video. This is a 12-month size sample here. So let's begin with the cast on. All right, we're going to do the long tail cast on to cast on stitches for our neckline. That's where we're going to begin stitching. Now I'm going to have all the materials that you need for this pattern written here on the side of the video. You can reference that. I am again just using the long tail cast on method for our cast on stitches. For this 18-month pattern, I am going to cast on 85 stitches. So I will see you when I'm done with these 85, and we'll get started with the first couple rows of this pattern. All right, I have my stitches casted on, and now we're going to start with the neckline here, and that is consists of a garter stitch, which means that we are knitting all the stitches on both the right side and the wrong side of the fabric. Now I'm also going to be doing an edge stitch at the beginning and end of each row. On my right side rows, I am going to be starting with a knit stitch and ending with a slip stitch knitwise with the yarn in back. And on my wrong side rows, I am going to be starting with a purl stitch and ending each wrong side row with a slip stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. And you'll see that throughout the pattern, me beginning and ending the rows in that fashion. So let me get to the end of this round. I'll show you what I'm doing with those edge stitches, and then we'll go on to row number 2. All right, I'm nearing the end of this row, and let me just show you quick what I'm doing with those edge stitches. So when I get to my last stitch on my right side row, I'm going to keep my yarn in back and just slip this knitwise off the stitch or off the needle. Now, if this was my wrong side row, I would be bringing the yarn to the front and slipping the stitch purlwise off. Okay, so that's the end stitch of every row. We're just going to slip it knitwise. And now we can go to row number 2, which is also knitting every stitches, but to begin with, I am going to begin with a purl stitch for that nice edge, and then go to knitting every stitch. So I'm going to do this wrong side row, then we're going to, which is row number 2, and then we're going to repeat rows 1 and 2 one more time. And then the next row, we are already at a point where we need to put a buttonhole in. So I will show you how to do that buttonhole when I get a few rows down on this neckline. All right, we're at the point where we need to do a buttonhole. Now this is a girl's sweater, so our buttonhole is always going to be at the end of a right side row. I have got 7 stitches left on this row, which is the width of this of our button band of our sweater. So that's where our buttonhole needs to be. We're going to start by knitting the first 3 of those 7 stitches. Then we're going to do just a simple yarn over, and then the next 2 stitches we will knit 2 together. Do 1 more knit stitch, and we'll end with that edge stitch, which is a slip stitch knitwise with the yarn in back. All right, so that produced a tiny little hole, which is going to be plenty big for a button. All right, I've got a few more rows of garter stitch to do. On our very last row of garter stitch, we're going to place some stitch markers to indicate where we're going to be doing the raglan increases. So I'll show you that next. All right, I'm ready to do my 10th and final row of the garter stitch for the neckline. And now we're going to place some stitch markers so we know where to do the raglan increases on the front and back of the sweater. So those are just going to remind us when to do increase stitches. We're also going to place 7 stitches in for our button band, so we know when to switch from stockinette stitch to garter stitch for the button band. All right, we are on the wrong side, so I'm going to start this wrong side row with a purl stitch, and then I'm going to do 6 more knit stitches where I'm going to place my first stitch marker, and that's just going to indicate when we switch from garter stitch to stockinette stitch on the edges here. So 6 and 7. Let's place a stitch marker here. Now we're going to count 11 stitches, knit 11 stitches for our next stitch marker, and that's for the front panel. Place another stitch marker there. Now we're going to need the stitches for the sleeve before our next stitch marker, and that's going to be 12 stitches. And we'll place a stitch marker here. Now the back section of the sweater is going to be 25 stitches. So let's count 25 and then place another stitch marker. Another stitch marker. Now we come to the sleeve again, and that is our 12 stitches. Another stitch marker, and now 11 for the front panel. Place our last stitch marker, and that is going to indicate the start of the last button band where we're going to be switching to garter stitch. So we'll knit the last 7 stitches. And we will slip our last stitch. All right, so now these stitch markers, as I mentioned, is going to tell us where we are going to do our increases. So on our next round, we are going to now switch to our main color. So I'm going to cut the purple yarn and add my beige yarn. And we're going to, this is just to indicate where we're switching from garter stitch to stockinette stitch. But the rest of these markers, we are going to knit up to 1 stitch before the marker and do an increase. Then slip the marker, do another knit stitch and an increase. We're going to do that, those 2 increases at every marker, and that's where these raglan increases are. Okay? All right, let's switch colors to our contrasting color to our main color. So we are just going to now cut our old color, and now we will start with our new color, which is the beige color. And let's do this first increase round together. Now we're also switching now to stockinette stitch for the main body of the sweater. So on the right side row, that's going to be all knit. When we knit the wrong side rows for stockinette stitch, that's going to be all purl stitches, except for this button band section, 7 stitches at the beginning and the end of the row is going to be garter stitch. So we'll continue to knit each row for that garter stitch. All right, so this is the right side. We will start by a knit stitch. We will knit these first 7 stitches because that is the button band. Slip this marker. We'll continue to knit because we're doing stockinette stitch, so that means knitting on the right side row. Let's knit till we have 1 stitch before our marker. All right, 1 stitch before our marker. Now we're going to do a make 1 right increase. So lift up that strand between your stitches, and we'll knit that stitch through the front loop for an increase. Knit 1 stitch, slip the marker, knit another stitch, and now let's do a make 1 left. So we'll do it in the opposite direction, a left leaning increase, and knit it through the back loop. And we'll knit again to the next marker. 1 stitch before the marker indicates our next increase, which will be a make 1 right. knit one, slip, knit one, and then make one left. And we'll knit to one stitch before the next marker. Another increase here, make one right. Knit one, slip the marker, knit one, and make one left. And knit to the next marker. All right, we are done with our increases on this round. We'll knit to the end here. This last stitch marker is just to indicate where our button band is, but we're continuing to knit for the right side row. And we will end with that slip stitch. All right, now let's turn our work. Now we are only going to be doing that increase row every other row. On our wrong side work, we are not doing any increases. We'll just purl all the way around except for our button band, which we will do knit stitches, and just slip the markers as we go. So on this wrong side row, let's purl the first stitch because that's our edge stitch, and we will knit to this first marker. Slip that marker. Now we'll switch to purling because we're on the wrong side and we're doing stockinette stitch, so we want to purl the wrong side. We'll just do this all the way until we get to that last stitch marker where we'll switch to knit stitches again for the garter stitch button band. The other stitch markers we will just slip as we go since we do not need to do any increases on the wrong side row. All right, when you get to that last marker, just slip that and remember to switch now to knitting stitches so we can knit those last 7 stitches in garter stitch. And then when we get to the last stitch, we will slip that stitch purlwise. Now this is a really loose stitch because it's the first stitch of that color, so we'll need to pull that a little bit tighter by pulling the tails of our 2 colors. All right, now we can turn our work. Now, as I mentioned, we will only be doing that increase round every other round. We're going to be doing that on the right side rows. On the wrong side rows, just purling. We will do this, continuing this, going on down this raglan increase section. For the 18-month size, we're going to be doing a total of 13 increase rows, which is 26 complete rows of knitting before we divide the stitches for the sleeve and continue on with the body of the sweater. Just a quick check-in as we're working on our yoke here. I want to make a note about the buttonholes. So we had done a buttonhole right here in the neckline, and we're going to need to do another buttonhole 16 rows down from the first one. So as you're working on your yoke, make a note to yourself to count down 16 rows, and on the end of a right side row, you will need to do the same little buttonhole sequence, that yarn over and knit 2 together that I shown you previously. So just a note to don't forget the buttonholes, and we can continue working on the yoke here, and I will return after that. All right, I've completed the yoke section of the sweater. I've also switched to a little bit of a darker background so you can see my light colored stitches a little bit better. So now what we're going to do is we're at this point in the sweater where we have completed the yoke section, and now we're just going to concentrate on the rest of the body of the sweater. But first, we're going to set aside the stitches that are on the sleeves so we can knit those later. and focus on the body of the sweater for now. So to do that, we are going to place those sleeve stitches on just a piece of scrap yarn. So I've taken a scrap piece of yarn, threaded onto a darning needle, and now we will knit this row. And when we get to this sleeve section, we will slip those to our stitch marker and set those sleeve stitches aside. So let's do that together here. Let's knit this row starting with a knit stitch. We'll slip our marker, we'll knit to this first marker where the raglan increase is before we slip those stitches to the yarn. Right when we get to that marker, we can just remove that marker. And now take your darning needle with your scrap yarn and just one by one slip those stitches from your needle to your darning needle. And these are the sleeve stitches. All right, this is the last of the sleeve stitches. We'll remove that marker as well. Pull your needle all the way through, so all those stitches now are resting on this scrap yarn, and we will knit those later. So now we can knit the back stitches. However, we need a few more stitches to make up for the underarm of the sweater. We want to just have a little bit of width there to constitute for the underarm here. So to do that, we're just going to cast on a few more stitches. We're going to cast on 6 stitches. We're using the thumb method to cast those on. So we're just looping the yarn around our thumb, slipping them onto the needle in this fashion, and that's going to create some cast on stitches. That's 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And now we can continue to knit these back stitches, and before we get to the next set of sleeve stitches, which we'll also put on some scrap yarn. All right, this next marker indicates I'm at the sleeves again, so we'll remove this marker, and let's take another piece of scrap yarn and thread those onto a darning needle as well. So just one by one, slip these off onto the scrap piece of yarn. And we're done with those sleeves, the sleeve stitches. We can remove our scrap yarn or our stitch marker again. And now we're to that point where we need to do those 6 cast on stitches again for the underarm of the sleeve. So let's just do our thumb loop method. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And now we can continue to knit the rest of the row, which is the front panel and the last button band there. All right, we are done with that row. So here is what we've got so far. So we have our, let's put it the right way here. Here's our neckline, our raglan increases, our sleeves are on the scrap yarn, and now we can continue working down the front and the back, the body of the sweater together. And we will continue that just in regular stockinette stitching, except for this button band. Don't forget to maintain that garter stitch on those last and first 7 stitches of each row. And then we will switch over to this really pretty linen stitch to finish up this bottom part of the sweater before we get to the hemline. All right, here is where we are at with the sweater. I've completed this body portion of the sweater with color A in stockinette stitch. So now we're gonna switch to this fun little accent stitching here at the bottom of the cardigan, where we will introduce our color B color once again and knit this stitch. This is called the linen stitch. Let's get my knitting turned around here. It's knitted with two colors, but we knit one color at a time. So it's a very nice, easy two-color stitch. Here's how that stitching goes. We're starting with our right side row. We are not going to cut color B, but we're just going to introduce now again color A, and we're going to knit these first 7 stitches because we'll continue with that button band for those first and last 7 stitches, which is garter stitch. Now we'll slip that marker and we'll do this two stitch sequence, which is knitting 1, then we're going to bring our yarn to the front and slip the next stitch purlwise, and then bring the yarn back to the back to knit again to the front purlwise. Okay, so that's that 2-stitch sequence that we will do all the way to the end of this row. Knit 1, slip 1 purlwise, knit 1, yarn in front, slip 1. So let me do this till the end. Well, actually till we get to 1 stitch before the 7-stitch garter band. We will end with a knit stitch and then switch to that garter stitch for the last 7 stitches. All right, I'm nearing the end of this row, so we will end with slipping that purlwise and then a knit stitch. Now we'll just switch to plain garter stitch to the end of this row. So that's knitting all the stitches, ending with our edge stitch, and we'll turn our work for row number 2. Now row number 2 is still done with color B, but we're just working on the wrong side row, so things are just a little bit different, but a similar sequence. So with the wrong side row, we are starting with a purl stitch, do knit stitches till that marker, and then we'll start with the linen stitch. Okay, this time we are going to be starting with the slip stitch purlwise again, but this time with the yarn in back. Okay, so we're going to be slipping the stitch purlwise with the yarn in back, then we'll bring our yarn forward and we'll do a purl stitch. So let's do, oops, slipped my yarn a little bit, there we go. Let's do those same 2 stitches again. We'll slip this stitch purlwise, but this time with the yarn in back, and then bring the yarn to the front so you can purl the next stitch. To the back to slip, yarn to the front to purl. And we'll continue that 2-stitch sequence to the end of this row, remembering to switch to garter stitch when you get to that marker. All right, a couple stitches left on this side, so let's purl this one, and we will slip this last stitch. Slip the marker, and let's go back to the garter stitch to the end of the row. And let's pull this last stitch a little tighter. We are going to slip it purlwise. Let's tighten up those last and first stitches of the old color. All right, so now we're going to turn our work again. And for the next 2 rows, we are going to do that exact same pattern that we just did, row 1 and row 2. Although this time we're just switching now back to color A. You do not have to cut color B. Just start again with color A that you still have hanging out here on the side. Just make sure that you are tucking color B behind color A, and you can start with that same row 1 pattern and repeat row 1 and 2 with color A, Then repeat 1 and 2 with color B, going back and forth like that until your linen stitch pattern here is for about 2 inches. Okay, so I'll come back when we've got a few rows in on the linen stitch before we switch down to the hemline. I've completed this linen stitch section. It's such a pretty accent stitch for the bottom of the sweater. It's one of my favorite stitches. So now we are ready to end this section and begin just with this solid color hemline to the sweater. That's going to be done with our color B. So now I can cut my color A yarn. We don't need that for this section, and we'll just be working with color B. For that garter stitch hem, we are just going to be simply knitting all the rows, including that button band row. So we no longer need our little markers to indicate where the button band is. So we can remove that. And we will just do this garter stitch now for 10 rows for that bottom hem. After I've completed those 10 rows of garter stitch for our hem, I'm just going to be doing a simple bind off to bind off that hem, and that will complete the body part of the sweater. Then we're going to move on to the sleeves. Okay, now that our body of our sweater is completely done, we can focus on doing the sleeves. Now remember, we had set these sleeve stitches aside and put them on scrap yarn, so now they're ready for us to pick those sleeve stitches back up and knit a small circumference in the round for our sleeves. Now you can do this in a number of different ways. If you like the magic loop method or the traveling loop method, which requires to still use a long circular needle to knit a small circumference, you are welcome to do that. I prefer to use double pointed needles, but it is your preference. I'm going to show you how to do it with the double pointed needles, but the same technique of picking up the stitches and also how we're going to deal with this little underarm section applies to any method that you use. Okay, so we have our sleeve stitches on our scrap yarn, and we know we have to pick those up, but we also have these couple underarm stitches that we had casted on previously. We casted on 6 of those, and we're going to be picking up those stitches, but we're also, if we don't do anything else other than just knit those underarms and the sleeves, we're going to end up with a little bit of a gap here between those 2 sets of stitches. So in order to eliminate that as much as possible, we are going to do some little maneuvering with these little gap horizontal bars here. I call them gap strands, to kind of make sure we're closing up that hole. So here's how we're going to do that. If you take one of your DPNs, we're going to start picking up stitches. We're not going to yet knit these stitches on our first round. We're just placing the stitches onto our needle. And the very first stitch we're going to do is right in between these 6 stitches. You can identify these 6 cast on stitches by the bottom little loop here. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Our new beginning of the round is going to be right between stitches 3 and 4. That's going to be our new beginning of round. So the very first stitch we're going to do is pick up this stitch right here. I'm going to actually pick it up from the top down. That's going to assure that the stitch is correctly orientated on the needle. So just pick up the stitch without knitting it. We're just placing it on our needle. Now we're going to do that on our next stitch and that next cast on stitch. So now 3 of them are on this needle. They're kind of tight stitches. So kind of slide them onto your needle. Okay, so now these gap strands we're also going to pick up. We're going to just place them on our needle in this fashion. And the reason why we're putting it in, looping it on our needle this way, is that when we knit our first round, we're actually going to eliminate these couple extra stitches by knitting them together with the stitch right next to it. So when we knit these 2 together, it's going to kind of twist that strand close, that little horizontal gap strand close, and eliminate some of that gap that we see with underarms. So now the other stitch we are also going to place on our needle, and we're going to place that one the other way on our needle. So then when we knit that together with the stitch next to it, it will also close it up. We're going to do a knit two together here and a SSK over here. Okay, so now let's continue to pick up our stitches, and now we're picking up, or just actually placing them on our needle, these stitches from our scrap yarn. So that first one is often kind of tucked pretty small in there. Make sure you grab that first one, and then each of the stitches, let's just place on our double pointed needle. Just the first one right now, let's place about a third of the stitches on this first needle, and then we'll pick up another DPN. Here's that last stitch, often tucked in there. Okay, now we've got these gap strands again, so we are again going to just loop them over our needle in this fashion so that they'll be closed together when we knit them together with the adjoining stitch. And now let's pick up these last 3 cast on stitches. All right, so now those 3 stitches are on our needle, and we've got our all of our stitches onto DPNs. At this point, you can remove your scrap yarn from your needles, and now we will begin to knit with our 4th DPN. You'll need a new working yarn. To start again, we're going to be using color A. So let's pick up our 4th needle, and we'll knit now these first 2 stitches. These were those cast on stitches. We'll knit those regular knit stitches, and now let's knit these next 2 together, the last stitch of our cast on and this first gap strand. We'll do a knit 2 together, knitting those 2 together. Now let's do a SSK, a slip slip knit. We're going to slip this purlwise, slip the second one knitwise, bring them to our other needle, and then knit those 2 together through the back loop. Now you can continue to knit in the round with your DPNs all the knit stitches that were on that scrap yarn from the sleeve. So let's get around to the other side, and then I'll show you how to finish that up. All right, here is my last stitch from my sleeve, and here's that little first gap strand that we picked up. So let's knit those 2 together, doing again the knit 2 together. And let's do a slip slip knit on these by slipping this to the right needle, back to the left needle, and knitting those 2 together through the back loop. And then we can finish by knitting these last 2 stitches that from that cast on underarm edge. Okay, so now we have knitted our first round of the sleeve. Here's your tail. I like to make sure I stuff that tail down into my sleeve so it doesn't end up on the outside of my sweater. All right, so now we can continue to knit in the round for our sleeve. All right, an additional thing that we're going to do as we're knitting down the sleeves is we're going to just do a few decreases down the sleeve so it tapers the sleeves a little bit to that cuff. We're not going to do many of those. We're going to just do 4 rows of decreases where we decrease at the beginning and the end of our round. we're going to, for the 18-month size sweater, we're going to do that decrease every 12 rows. So that kind of evenly spaces out the decreases down the sleeve. I've completed 11 rounds of knitting, and now I'm ready to do a decrease round on my 12th round. So let's do that decrease round together. We're going to start with a decrease on this very first 2 stitches of the round, and we're going to knit those 2 together. So let's do a knit 2 together, and then simply just knit around the round until you have 2 stitches left at the end of the round. All right, now when you have 2 stitches left on your round, we will do a slip, slip, knit for that last decrease. So slip, slip, move them to your other needle, and then knit them together through the back loop. And that will do your decrease at the beginning and the end of the round, and we'll again do that decrease every 12th row until we have 4 of those completed, and we'll be done with the sleeve section, and we'll just finish up with the last little bit of garter stitch for the hem. All right, I'm at the point of the sleeves where I've completed my decreases, and I'm ready to now switch to my color B and do 10 more rows of garter stitch. Now this is for my 18-month size, about 7 inches from my underarm, and that indicates that I'm ready to switch to garter stitch. So I can cut off my color A yarn and begin working with my color B again. Now remember, when you're knitting with garter stitch in the round, instead of knitting every row like we did when we knitted back and forth, you will now need to knit row 1 and then purl all stitches for row number 2. So once you've done that, row 1 knit, row 2 purl, do that for 10 rows. You can bind off in whatever method you'd like to finish that cuff and finish that sleeve. Then you will just follow the same exact directions and instructions that we did for the first sleeve and complete the second sleeve. And that will pretty much finish our project, except for a couple little finishing things that I will note at the end. So I will see you when both sleeves are complete. All right, we are done with the knitting portion of the sweater. So all that is left to do is to do a couple little finishing things to really polish up the finished look of the sweater. First of all, of course, you will want to weave in any ends you have. And at this point too, if you're unsatisfied with still some of the little gaps under your arm, you can at this time take the tail from under your arm and just make a couple little quick little stitches to close in some of those gaps underneath the arm if you like. So you would do that next, and then I'm going to take some time to really wet block this well. What that's going to do is really smooth out these stitches, straighten out the edges so everything is the right shape for the sweater. So I'm going to soak this in some warm water till it's nice and saturated. Then I will squeeze the excess water out. Do not wring it, just squeeze the water out, and then lay it flat and really smooth everything out. You might want to pin the corners so your edges are nice and straight, and that's going to make for a much more polished look of the sweater. Now that I've blocked the sweater or weaved in all my ends, it is looking really, really nice. It really smoothed it out and shaped it nicely. Now I'm just going to add my buttons, and what I did there is just put a little removable stitch marker right where my buttonhole peeps through to the other side. And that's how you know that your buttonholes will be lined up with your buttons. I picked out a few fun little buttons to sew on, and I'm going to sew those on right at that spot with just a little smaller needle this time that will fit through my buttonhole. And let's sew those 3 buttons on, and then we're all finished. Now that our sweater is complete, I hope you have a beautiful little toddler or baby that will love this handmade sweater for them. I hope you give it a try. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe for other videos all about knitting tips and tutorials, really creative stitches and fun patterns. Thanks for watching, everybody. Happy knitting.